And when you start to, I guess, develop a strategy, you realize that if you combine aggression with those percentages, you start being able to make profitable decisions. So an example would be like if I have a flush draw with 36% equity and I estimate in a situation my opponent, if I bet, say I bet $50 into $50, and I estimate my opponent will fold 40% of the time. Well, if you take 40% and 36%, you get around 36% or 76% equity. So you start thinking about these kind of things, and you develop an aggressive game plan. And basically, anytime your equity starts exceeding 50%, it's usually a good time to be aggressive. Um, and it's a very simplified explanation, but that kind of illustrates what I meant by that, by equity.
So this question I was going to ask you relate to the song I heard about Kenny
Yeah.
Kenny Rogers, how to know when to hold them and when to fold them. Can you?
Good song.
It's a very famous song. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. So, and I guess I also mentioned the different types of poker players. So
Right. That was going to be a separate question. I was going to ask you about that. A different type of poker players. Yeah.
Well, this one's honestly it's pretty straightforward. Typically in in live poker specifically, online poker is a little bit different in that there's a lot more aggressive, good players. But in a live setting, the competition's typically not super strong. So to keep the answer pretty short, whenever you're taking an aggressive action and your opponent gets very aggressive back at you, a lot of times they deserve a lot of respect, and you should be willing to make like very big folds and fold, and basically just give up on the hand a lot. It's not always the case, but if you're playing against a guy, it really, I mean, there's a lot of factors that goes into it, but if you're playing against a guy who, I don't know, say he's like, if he's above the age comes into it partly too. Like typically people who are a little bit older are a little bit more conservative from what I've observed. So, if I bet 20 and I get raised to 60 from a guy who's 70 years old, a lot of times, they just have the goods, and it's a good time for me to get out of the situation and let my hand go. Um, and then, if I'm playing against a guy who's a little younger and who's splashing his money around a lot, that might be a good time to hold on to my hand and just let him keep bluffing.
Right. So on the table, you can get out anytime and enter anytime.
That's right.
The rule?
Yeah.
Wow. So let's talk about the different type of players now, because it's like in the jungles. When you look at the animal, they don't have refrigerator, they don't have a Publix or Walmart to go to. But in the lions, for example, have to eat 60 pounds of meat. So therefore, they have to hunt either a gazelle or a zebra to feed themselves. In animal kingdom, you have aggressive players, you have counter punchers, you have some animal who play waiting games, some animal play surprise or ambush type. So in poker,
that's funny you say that.
What are the type of player you have? In tennis, we have that too. In tennis, we have 5 different type of players. You have aggressive baseliner, counter puncher, serving volleyers, awkward players, and the one we call voter, the the one to wait. But let's talk about the three different players on in term poker, or if it's
Yeah,
more than three, maybe.
it's funny you make the animal comparison. There's a famous poker player from maybe like back in the 70s. He kind of created uh, like animal profiles for different styles, and I think he used things like the elephant, the lion. The lion kind of sits back and pounces on opportunities, and um, so like there are technically subgroups, so there would be more than types, but for understanding, I guess just for like keeping it simple, and how I learned when I first started learning poker, I read this book called Easy Game by Andrew Seidman, and he
Can you say
broke
that
it.
name again? What's the name?
It's Easy Game by Andrew
Easy,
Seidman. Easy Game. Yep.
easy game.
Easy Game by Andrew Seidman, and
Oh,
yep. And he's actually who I learned a lot of the concepts I know and apply today. He was a coach back in the early 2010s era, and he made a lot of online content through a training site called Deuces Cracked, which isn't in existence anymore. And he was a great coach, and I learned a lot of what I know through his writing and stuff. So he basically broke down poker players into three categories. There's the loose passive player, there's the loose aggressive player, and then there's the good aggressive player. So basically, the two categories of so loose passive and loose aggressive. Typically, those are the players who aren't winning money in poker, and those are typically the people who you're making all your money off of. And then you have the good aggressive players, and those are players who are applying aggressive concepts, and they understand how to choose the correct hands to play in different situations, in different positions. So the first and most common player type is the loose passive, and this is the player type I was referring to from the Kenny Rogers song. Um, the loose passive player typically they basically call the minimum bet with most of their hands. So say there's a $3 blind. If they wanna get involved, most of the time they will call $3 with many hands, maybe 7-5 offsuit, maybe 8-4 suited, uh, Queen Jack offsuit, maybe even like King 4 offsuit. They'll play a lot of weak hands in a weak way, just trying to see a cheap flop. And these kind of players, they typically will take passive actions like that, and then whenever they get aggressive, you the heuristic is basically to fold your hand unless you have the very best hands in a given situation. So, if say a player like that limps, or it's called limping when you call the minimum blind. Say they call it $3 and I raise a hand like Ace Jack offsuit. If say I raised to $15, and if he decides to re-raise me before the flop and makes it say 50, there's a very, very, very high probability that a player like that is only doing that with like queen, queen, king, king, and ace, ace, and therefore I can pretty much fold any hand other than maybe king, king, king. Um, so those kind of players, they play a lot of weak hands, and how you beat them is to play very aggressively against them, raise hands with big cards in them, try to flop good pairs, and then value bet those pairs. And then you have the loose aggressive players, and typically these guys, they don't do a great job at hand selection. They play too many hands before the flop. They may play them in a more aggressive manner, which makes them harder to play against, because when someone's being aggressive against you with more hands, you actually have to start making some decisions, and they can, and because they're playing aggressive, it means you're naturally gonna make some mistakes, because they'll bluff you sometimes, or because they're bluffing, sometimes you have to call them with a weak hand, and then they have a good hand, so it complicates things. But in
Okay.
general, their uh,
Oh,
their mistake is just playing too many hands before the flop, and then playing them in a way that uh, isn't going to be good long term.
right.
And then you have the good aggressive players, and
Okay.
that
Hold on to hold there. We're gonna take a break,
okay.
and then that was the conclusion of our first part on Ryan Spicer, professional poker player. We're gonna get back to you in about. We're gonna give you a 2 to 3 minute break and get back to you again for the second part of this interesting subject on how to play poker strategy and all the goodies. All right. This
Sounds
is
good.
Sekou Radio. Our guest today is Ryan Spicer, professional poker player.